about Vincent William van Gogh. He was born in the Netherlands. He was the son of a minister. So he was raised and really was faithful his entire life. He failed at a lot of things. He thought he loved art and he thought he could work for his brother and be an art dealer. However, he didn't have success with that. He believed, okay, I'm going to go be a missionary. And he worked hard at that and put his heart and soul into it. And he failed at that because the people that he was trying to actually help and, minister rejected him, which is heartbreaking. He proposed to different women throughout his life. There weren't really relationships, they were more infatuations. So he never really had successful, loving relationships. He returned home to live with his parents, and they didn't really want him. And so he ended up being quite a loner, which was sad for him as a man, but amazing for the art world and for the development of him as an artist. So he moved to Brussels, and he did actually have some academic training. He studied art at the Royal Academy. He starts painting later in his 20s, which is maybe a little bit later. If you think about the Renaissance artists that we talked about, they all started their apprenticeships, at 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So he was a little bit late in starting his painting career. Early on, this is an example of his very famous first painting called The Potato Eaters, over here to the right. He really worked with these muted, somber, or sad earth tones. And then things changed. He moved to Paris and he discovered what his art would be. He basically started to see what the Impressionists were doing, and he was blown away. He complains that his brother, who was basically his lifelong companion, Theo, was not selling his work. And Theo and Vincent had a really interesting and detailed relationship. And the reason that it's detailed is because the letters that they wrote back and forth to each other during this 10 to 12 years when Vincent was trying to actually become an artist are all saved, and they've been published. And so people are able to read about the relationship between these two brothers. And Theo was basically the only person during his life that truly was supportive of Vincent. And they actually are buried side by side in the graveyard at the church, where they're buried today. So kind of his love story was with art, but also his loving relationship was with his older brother, Theo. Theo wasn't not selling his artwork. It was because people did not want to buy Vincent's artwork. So his brother was an art dealer who worked in Paris. Vincent would paint, let's say he'd paint 5 or 10 within a month, and then he'd package them all up and he'd send them to his brother, and he'd write this, very passionate letter of like, Theo, I think I've done it now. I think this is going to change the world. I think the Paris art community is going to love what they see. And Theo would put them on display in his gallery and people wouldn't purchase them. But Theo almost went broke himself by sending his brother money to support his painting. So again, it just contributes to this really sad story. But Theo thought, again, that this early stuff was too dark and encouraged Vincent to kind of branch out and explore some new color and some new style, and he certainly did. So again, in 1888, he cut off a part of his ear after a fight with Gogh, and they left. Gauguin left. The idea, the dream was over of the artist colony. Sadly, though, it is documented that Van Gogh suffered from mental illness throughout his life, which, if you really think about this whole sad story of, his early life and not having a lot of success or love, and then later in life, and he did not live to be a very old man at all. We'll get to that at the conclusion of this presentation. But he lived a lonely life. He suffered from mental illness. He eventually chose to live in a mental asylum and then was released throughout the day to go out and paint just for his own good because he really was losing it. People didn't know what he was doing, though. These other artists, these other post-impressionists, this artist society in France happening and blooming at this time was, a small group, and they were always in contact with each other, like I've mentioned, writing letters and talking about and with each other. And so people were seeing his art, and they knew what he was doing, and they really admired him and were impressed by it because it was very avant-garde. It was pushing the boundaries. It was something new. It was something bold, very expressive. From his palette directly to the canvas. And so you can see this layered unblendedness. So when you look up close, it's really kind of messy. That's the pillows in his bed in one of his famous paintings of his room. So this unmixed red, and this unmixed kind of ochre color. So speaking of color, he's one of the first artists to use color in an arbitrary way. That's a must know. So he's using color almost symbolically, not realistically. His colors often were selected and used without reference to those found in reality. So his sky isn't always blue. Sometimes you'll see different colors mixed in, or the sun isn't always yellow-orange. He's using colors very expressively. Again, this is one of my favorites because I love it. Speaking of color, he's one of the first artists to use color in an arbitrary way. That's a must know. So he's using color almost symbolically, not realistically. His colors often were selected and used without reference to those found in reality. So his sky isn't always blue. Sometimes you'll see different colors mixed in, or the sun isn't always yellow-orange. He's using colors very expressively. Again, this is one of my favorites because I love the colors, but you see this kind of halo, this radiation, this unblended red, kind of an exaggerated perspective, like everything's just moving and buzzing. And it's a little bit better of a version. I like this. The scene was meant to capture a place that could cause destruction of the soul. So this was actually a bar down the street from the yellow house that Van Gogh rented and lived in the south of France. And so this was a place that he knew well. You can see how all of these people are hunched over. He was definitely known to drink absinthe, which was a really basically poisonous liquor that maybe even contributed to the mental illness in his brain. Documenting their little room that he had. Okay, so here's our Starry Night, the one that's included in the 250. So towards the end of his life, he really, like I said, he had this collaboration, very short-lived, with Gogh, who I believe was kind of just using him as a transitional space place to live before he moved on. And he was basically institutionalized. So he had this famous breakdown where he cut off his ear in this fight with Gogh, and so he mutilated himself, and then he was basically hospitalized in a nearby asylum, a clinic for the mentally ill near another small village. And so this is actually it. And one of these upper windows is where Van Gogh is supposedly where his room was, and he looked out from this vantage point to the night sky, and he painted this, what I believe to be a beautiful painting. Even in kind of the worst place that he could imagine in life, he saw beauty. So if you can imagine him in the window and he's looking out over this landscape at night, this is what his brain and his emotions saw. When I was young, I was used to seeing this, didn't know anything about the artist or, anything about the painting, but it's pretty recognizable imagery or iconography. And a lot of people still ask me this, what the heck is this thing? If you don't know, I'll tell you, this is a cypress tree. So this was actually like a very tall, thin tree that are found throughout France and Spain and Italy. And so this would have been closer in the foreground, and that's why it's like a little bit kind of imposing, is that would have been closer into his sight line, and then the cities and the mountains, and then basically the skyscape behind. So here's some close-up. Really good example of that unblended color. So he would pick up several blues on his brush and lay them all down at once. And when they mixed, if they did, they were actually mixing on the canvas. They weren't pre-mixed. So he began to have an obsession with color and the idea or the power that color had as a symbol or as an emotion or a meaning. And following Van Gogh and his work, he really had great influence on a lot of these isms to follow that we'll get into later this week. Expressionism, Fauvism, and abstract art. Okay, so for the form, the Starry Night, really short brush strokes, very strong wave-like pattern. I'm moving from left to right. This really is kind of a study of light or the effect of light from the stars and the moon on this landscape. So that's really the buzz. That's really the idea, the expressiveness of this work. The cypress tree, which I mentioned, could be conceived as a symbol of death or eternal life. It kind of looks like flames reaching into the sky, like it could be overtaking this entire landscape. This really is an individualized expression in a modern landscape painting. It's how he saw it. It's how he felt. It's his own perception and beautification of something that was real, basically a moon and stars and a dim lit city at night. The mountains are there. They're known for sure. That truly is a mountainscape that you can see from this asylum that Van Gogh was staying in. And a composite landscape. So we know the word composite, that's composed of multiple views. And so the landscape isn't completely accurate. You couldn't take a picture from this window and say, oh, it matches up perfectly. It's basically his creation or his, investigation of other landscapes that were familiar to him, and he composed them into just one almost make-believe or imaginary landscape. So context, the artist could see this view is from his room. And I love this because even though he was in total despair in life, he saw this amazing beauty and was truly able to communicate it. It really became a foundational image for Expressionism, expressive color, movement, feeling, emotion, symbolism. Sorry. This was, I believe, one of his final pieces. Towards the end, his paintings became really turbulent, meaning like look at even more movement and almost darker. Like this is kind of ominous with the crows flying away, and are they moving because he's walking into their space? And you can just imagine really what's happening in his brain and in his life. He died early at the age of 37. So I'm 38 years old. I feel old, but I'm not that old, in the whole idea of actual, youth to being a senior citizen. So he wasn't even middle-aged. The story is that he actually went into one of these fields and he was completely, desperate and in despair and kind of heartbroken. And the word that we would use today is, clinically depressed. All of these things were going very wrong in his life, and he was isolated and lonely, and he felt defeated. And he actually had a pistol, and he shot himself in the stomach. And this isn't funny, but being unsuccessful at almost everything else in life, Van Gogh was unsuccessful at actually killing himself. And so it was not a mortal wound. He had to get up, walk all the way back into the town to go to the hospital once he tried to commit suicide. And so he was in the hospital, and they were able to actually reach his brother Theo and have Theo be able to come to his side and be with him before he actually did die.